Welcome back to the YouTube studio here at the Munich Security Conference. And my next guest is Volker Türk. Thanks for being here.
Very happy to be here.
You are the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights since October 2022, so 3 years now, a time which has been quite challenging, I suppose, for you as well. And now at the Security Conference, we have new developments. I just spoke to Robert Habeck, the still Federal Minister for Finance in Germany, not for finance, for economics in Germany, and he said, "Well, it's something new has happened. Things have changed." I would like to know from you, which role would you say is the UN playing in conflicts and in finding peace, especially currently?
It's absolutely critical to know why the United Nations were founded 80 years ago. And it goes back to 2 world wars, the Holocaust, atrocity crimes, the Great Depression, and a feeling among countries at the time that they don't want any repeat of this. So what did they do? They created the United Nations, the Charter, with very clear principles, the Human Rights Framework, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was meant precisely to act as constraints on unhealthy, toxic power dynamics, on privilege, and on transaction.
What would you say? You just mentioned toxic dynamics, toxic behavior. What is that in your mind?
We have 59 countries that are currently facing violent conflict. That's where the toxicity comes out of power dynamics. Look at Sudan. Look at Russians' aggression against Ukraine. Look at what's happening still in the Middle East. Look at what's happening currently, as we speak, in the eastern part of Congo.
Yeah.
Yes, it has a lot to do with power.
Let's take a look at, because you mentioned Russia, let's take a look at Ukraine, especially because it's a huge topic during the Security Conference. What is being discussed about human rights actually regarding Ukraine and regarding what has been discussed as a solution, let's say?
So on the human rights front, my office has been there since 2014. So we have been there for a very long time, and we have been documenting, reporting, monitoring the situation. So we know very well, almost on a day-by-day basis, what happened in the conflict. And what is so important is to actually bring out the facts, because we live in a time when there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So it's so important. That's also the role of the media and of independent and free journalism, to bring out the facts, to say what these facts mean in terms of the respect for the rules of law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, but also to bring out the human stories that are behind it. Otherwise, we talk about abstract concepts of war. No, it means a disabled woman living on the 4th floor in a building in Kiev who is not able to get out because the electricity doesn't work, because it was just bombarded. So we need to bring it back to the human story of what war means, what violence means, what violations mean.
Did you have the chance to actually go to Ukraine and go to your office and to talk to people?
Yes, I was there. It was one of my first trips that I did as High Commissioner in December 22.
So rather early?
It was rather early. I mean, the first country I visited was Sudan. The second was Ukraine. And I met, obviously, with survivors, with victims. I went to Bucha, to the north of Kiev, where horrible atrocities had occurred. I went to Kharkiv, very close to the line of fire. And you see how a country how a society is affected by the conflict. At some stage, we had to go into a bunker because there was an aerial bombardment happening. So, and for them, for Ukrainians, this has become their daily normal. And yes, we need to bring out these stories and tell the story that peace is extremely important, but it has to be peace in line with the United Nations Charter.
Do you have the feeling that those kind of stories, those personal stories, totally get lost in those discussions we see now?
I think my feeling is more and more that we lose a sense of interconnectedness and we lose a sense of solidarity with people.
Because it's so abstract?
Because
we don't lose
I think
touch?
Sometimes what I see often is politics of distraction, meaning that the non-issues that should not actually preoccupy us are becoming the big issues, and we lose sight of what really is happening in societies, what really is happening around the world, and that we see our lives connected with other parts of the world. Just to give you the example, your iPad, my iPhone, are nourished by cobalt,
Yes.
coltan,
Yeah.
which is mostly coming from the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you have a civil war going on.
Yeah.
Not only, a civil war, but also now with M23 plus Rwanda support, a very horrible situation. So why is it happening? Why do these things occur? And we need to ask ourselves, because it is directly affected it's connected with our lives, and we sometimes don't see these interconnections enough, and we need to.
How do you, you talk to powerful people here at the conference. How do you try to implement those stories in the minds of politicians, if you try that?
Well, of course, my role is to not only speak about and have very uncomfortable and difficult conversations with some people, but also, and that's really, I think, more and more our role is to communicate about the value of human rights, what it means for this world, how in a very polarized, divided world, it can actually bring us together, because it's about our dignity, it's about our humanity, and that humanity is present for everyone. It's not just for one person, for one situation. We have no exceptionalism. And that we come back to this innermost feeling of connection and connectedness.
What was the last, because you just mentioned difficult conversations, what was the last difficult conversation, even here at the conference, but maybe also in general? You just remember, and you just couldn't believe that the other person at the opposite side of the table just didn't understand what you wanted from him or her.
I talked to both warring parties of Sudan. I talked to Burhan and Hemeti on the phone, because I met them before when I was in Sudan. And I wanted to make it very clear to them that the reports that we get about the very massive violations of human rights and international humanitarian law that occur on a daily basis are their responsibility. They have command responsibility in relation to what is happening. Of course, they all explain, no, it's not quite this, and they argued against some of the findings that we put forward. But I also wanted to put them in front of their responsibilities towards their own people.
How do they react when you kind of confront
defensive
them?
At times. In some instances, there is always a justification why certain things are happening. But the main point is made.
And how do you react then when they get defensive?
We keep explaining to them and we keep making our point, but it has consequences when we talk to them about these things. And I give you another example. I wrote to the previous Prime Minister of Bangladesh when the student protests happened last year in July and August. And I told her that it was extremely important that the repression stops, because it could have consequences when it comes to Bangladesh being a troop contributing country. Their involvement of the army, for example, would have serious consequences from a human rights perspective. And I think it did help in some ways that the army in the end did not get involved in the repression.
How important is it that those nations, those governments, those powerful people have actual trust to you as a person? Because without trust to you as a person, I think it would be quite difficult, right, to convey them and to convince them of things that you want them to do.
Of course, in our line of work, we need to create trust. We need to build trust. We need to also show that we are not out to get people, but we also have a job to do. And we also have to approach it, especially human rights, we have to approach it with a lot of humility. It doesn't help to come in any arrogant way, because we know that the world of human rights is not perfect anywhere, by the way. So it is also important to bring in this personal element and also the personal connection. Of course, you connect with people or you don't connect with them. And so these chemistry issues, yes, they play a role.
One thing that I'm very interested in is whether a lot of states kind of see human rights as a business, as something to deal with, to make deals with. Do you agree with that in an extent, that it is sort of a business in some instances?
Well, it is. the fundament of our societies. It is the fundament of the interaction that we have with each other as human beings. It's also the relation. It defines the relationship between people and citizens and non-citizens with the state, with the institutions of the state. It defines our relationship with the environment. That's all about human rights. So it is actually at the heart of governance, not of government, of governance.
But even if they attach it, let's say, to proper business solutions, right?
Yeah.
Is that something you would trade in for, like make compromises if you achieve your goals then?
I mean, it's a question how much transaction there is. I mean, of course, when you try to find a solution, you negotiate, and you may not end up always with the optimal solution. But it has to be based on the understanding of the principles and the values and the law. And there are guardrails that you cannot go beyond.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. But on business more generally, business and the private sector and human rights, that's also a very interesting topic, because business and human rights is an obligation that we don't often talk about.
Yeah.
And we need to.
Where do you see problems? Let's say especially in Germany or like big countries which are important in Europe. Where do you see still problems in terms of that?
You mean on
business and human rights, like private business?
I mean, for instance, supply chains. So whatever products we consume.
A lot of parties, by the way, in Germany, also big parties who might end up in the government soon, who want to, less of those supply chain controls, which is interesting.
Sustainable business. So those who know that in order to survive and to take also, of course, profit is part of the rationale of making business, and you want to gain money. But you can only do it if you are sustainable and if you are respectful of the human rights of others. So it goes back to labor standards wherever products are produced, for example, in other countries. Labor standards at some stage, if they are not respected, they will be with you and they will follow you. And at some stage, things will happen that could actually go very badly for you and for your business. And we have seen this, the garment industry in Bangladesh, for example, or in many other countries. So human rights, in a way, helps you navigate difficult topics, but it gives you a compass. It gives you not only a moral compass, it also gives you a legal compass. It helps you go through what could otherwise become problematic in the future. And that's also for business. And those businesses, and we have a lot of discussions with them, that embrace human rights, that embrace sustainability, are doing much better.
Last question, or like last frame, which I'd like to open. A multipolar world, right? I mean, we live in a world, and since yesterday, maybe, as Europeans, we might even think more about a different way of the world is arranged. How do you act as a UN, which should kind of combine, which should bring nations in terms of standards together? How do you work in this ever-changing framework, and especially now?
I mean, first of all, to remind everyone that you need rules, you need guardrails, you need constraints on the exercise of power. Because otherwise it's the power of the strongest and it's the power of the bullies. And we cannot have that, because we have seen where this can lead to. I mean, before the First World War, you had a world order that was multipolar, but it didn't have rules.
That's
so
true.
we learned
Less
lessons.
rules.
Different rules, but they were more the rules of the one who is exercising the power and who wants to exercise it more.
Survival of the fittest in its
survival of the
extreme
fittest, yes, all of this. And so I think the history teaches us that you need indeed rules, which is what is embodied in the United Nations Charter. And it came out of a very clear historical experience that is as valid today as it was then. Because power dynamics are not new. They're always the same. You just have to master them.
And different nations now develop maybe different power dynamics. And I guess you need to react and see where it leads to.
Yes, and we need to be very clear-eyed and very determined.
Mr. Türk, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time. Thanks for answering my questions. And I said to Robert Habeck, have fun still on the conference. He said, well, that's nothing you should say at a conference, but have interesting conversations, let's say.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.